I'm a licensed clinical social worker with Robin's Hope. Robin's Hope is a trauma recovery center for adults. We are housed in Chesterfield, Virginia. Right now, with the pandemic, we are having online groups, a variety of different groups, at least one every weekday, that are open to anybody who wants to log in and check it out. We do a variety of things to help people develop resilience and heal from the traumatic events of life. So we've got some book groups, we've got a life skills group, a care and compassion group, and then we have support groups that are specifically designed around resilience skills that can be taught that help with healing. So all the information's up there on the slide. robinshope.com has all the online groups with links to Zoom to get into them, to participate, and everything else you could want to know.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us. We are excited to hear what you have to say. I know childhood trauma is something that I've personally experienced affecting my parenting. But yeah, interested to hear everything about it. So I guess before we get into the questions, can you tell us about your background and how you got started in this type of work?
Sure. So I've been a counselor for 20 some odd years now. Started working with children and families and found myself very drawn to the more severe end of things. So I was working in a group home for kids that had been removed for severe neglect and abuse, could not tolerate being in a family setting. So everything about my professional experience has always been trauma informed, and just very passionate about seeing the hopefulness of trauma being the one disorder, that the mental disorder that can actually be healed and cured, where everything else kind of goes into remission or is managed with medication. With trauma treatment, things actually get better to the point that people will no longer need supportive treatments. So I've always been interested, done a lot of work with kids and families in hospitals and treatment centers, and then started my own private practice. And one of the things that I saw with the private practice is that I had a lot of people that would come in for individual counseling and feel like they were the only ones that were ever going through what they were going through, or they felt like they couldn't talk to their friends because their friends didn't get it and they were isolated. And they were depressed, so they felt like they couldn't make friends. So I really just wanted to create a space where that social connection could happen, because that's one of the big resilience skills that helps us heal, is being in community with other people that get it. So I started talking with my roommate, who's a peer specialist, which means that she has a long history of trauma herself, has learned how to use her story to help walk other people through their healing journey. And we started talking about wanting to bring both the clinical and the lived experience together to enrich the healing experience, and started with one evening group going, okay, well, we'll try it. We've tried a trauma group before and nobody shows up, because the idea of talking about the worst thing that ever happened to you is not really appealing to do in front of a bunch of strangers. And while we were in that planning process, we ran into a training where this card deck was introduced that used 42 resilience skills in addition to traumas. And so my brain, that doesn't like to plan much, was like, oh, we're doing weekly groups and there's 52 cards in this deck. Yeehaw, I won't have to plan anything. We can just shuffle up, draw a card, and there we go. So that's what we did. And we had people show up, yay, and they were very receptive. They were very, able to engage, because we weren't asking them to talk about the traumas directly. We were talking about healing, the barriers to healing, how these simple things like asking for help us to heal. so we got people engaged, and then from there we just started building out our programs. We now have 2 full days of programming when we're face to face, and like I said, now that we're on video for all of our groups, we've added in at least 1 group per weekday, so that folks that are sheltering in place all alone can have some social connections still ongoing day to day to keep them from going down the rabbit trail of despair. So
Yeah,
it's been
that's
going
awesome.
really well. Yeah.
I bet like right now, the surge in mental health needs probably have gone up a lot. I don't know if you've experienced that. Um,
I haven't directly, just because my practice, I've been closed to new clients for months now.
yeah,
And every time I think I can reopen and take new people in, my schedule gets crammed again. So I've been a little bit distanced from that because I've kind of shut down a lot of those influxes. Um, but we have been seeing, new people jump into the group room. Some people that wouldn't be brave enough to come in person will come in through the online. People that are more distant, we've had folks signing on from Boston. One person that was in our group moved to California. She's been able to join in again. So it's been really nice, and I think we're going to keep that going
yeah,
even
that's
when we get
awesome to
back
get.
to also doing face to face. So
Yeah, it's awesome to get people from all sorts of the part of the country, world, to be able to join if
yes.
they've never, heard of you before. Then it's, you get
Yeah,
exposure, which is great.
yeah, it's wonderful. And it's the only group like we've done for grant writings, we've been trying to find other programs like ours. And there is nothing out there, which just shocks and amazes me because it's not that difficult to,
Yeah,
to come up with this concept. Um, so
yeah,
I moved the slide ahead to this, what is trauma? Because that's kind of where we need to start. Some people will hear the word trauma and find themselves thinking, or what we've seen is, oh, I know somebody who has a traumatic brain injury, or, oh yeah, my friend was in a car accident and got himself all banged up. Right, so we're looking at emotional trauma. And emotional trauma, the simplest definition that we base all of our work on is anything that overwhelms my ability to cope. Because that definition kind of is flexible enough to let us think about, yes, there are things that we would all agree are traumatic, like war is traumatic no matter who you are. Abuse is traumatic no matter who you are. But there are some things that are only traumatic to some people. So like a small child going in for a surgery sees all these big people in masks that look like monsters and is terrified. Well, if I was an adult going in for that same surgery and I knew this was, an elective surgery to fix a problem and I was going to feel better because of it, it's probably not traumatic to me. So there's those things that may be traumatic for one person and not another. If I have a lot of coping skills, I have a lot of support after an event, I might not become traumatized by it, but somebody that had the same event happen to them who doesn't have that support might become traumatized by that same event. So that definition really kind of gives that flexibility to look at trauma is a perspective. If it feels traumatic to the individual, then it's traumatic. There's no like, it used to be in the old DSM that it had to be life-threatening in order to qualify. And now we realize that it doesn't have to be necessarily life-threatening to be traumatic, that the same impact to your brain can still go on. The next definition I have on there is from SAMHSA, the Mental Health and Substance Abuse organization for the federal government. And that's kind of the gold standard one that talks about trauma results from an event, series of events that's experienced by an individual as harmful or life-threatening and has adverse effects. So that takes those 3 components into effect. It has to be something that happened that was experienced as really bad and that impacts your well-being over time. And then, some of the things that we typically associate with trauma, just down there at the bottom: abuse, sexual assault, neglect, car accidents, natural disasters. Those are some of the front and center ones that come up. It's not an exhaustive list.
So I remember you saying that something can be traumatic to one person and not another. Um, is is there like a common trauma that you see among parents specifically, I guess? Something that, you know, is, yeah, I guess like the most common one, or is it, or does it vary between person, culture? Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely varies. I think when you're looking at parenting, it generally comes back to childhood traumas that tend to get activated. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go forward. Um, Unfortunately, there's no trauma knows no bounds. 7 out of 10 Americans have experienced at least one trauma in their lifetimes. Um, so we're looking at things that are ubiquitous. It might be living, growing up in a drug addicted home. It may be having experienced sexual abuse, molestation. Uh, it can be all kinds of things. It can be subtle things like not having enough clothes to wear, food to eat, those neglect things, not having your emotional needs met that don't really register in somebody's head as traumatic, um, but are. Uh, so I've got on here the impact of trauma. Um, the handy model of the brain is kind of a cute thing, makes it really easy to understand what we're talking about. So it basically starts that you put your hand up, and you fold your thumb in and fold your fingers over, and you basically now have a model of a brain right at the end of your hand. Right? So our brain stem is what's typically known as the lizard brain, or the reptilian brain. It handles things like our breathing rates, our respiratory, our heartbeats, those things that happen without us consciously thinking about them. It's our survival brain. And then our limbic system is our midsection of our brain, and that covers our emotional processing, and it's also where our fight-flight mechanisms live, so our emergency centers are in here. That's kind of our mammalian brain they'll talk about. And then if you fold your fingers over, that kind of represents our prefrontal cortex and our thinking brain. This is the part of the brain that's in charge of talking, ordering what came first, what came second, what happened now, what happened then, and doing those logical thoughts when we think about normal thought patterns. So usually our brain is all connected and all those pieces are working together. But when we've been traumatized, when something really bad happens, the sensory information comes in from the outside world, lights up our limbic system, danger, danger, danger. We go into fight, flight, and all the blood flow stops, or not all the blood flow, but blood flow gets directed to the limbic system. We don't get so much to the prefrontal cortex. So we flip our lid, lose our mind, and we're functioning in instinct, right? Because when a tiger is chasing you down the African safari, you don't need to be, oh, dear Mr. Tiger, can we schedule for sometime next week? I have an opening in my schedule, but I don't need all of that. So that doesn't get blood. What gets blood is you need to run or fight really hard and get this attacker off of you. So we like to use that just to kind of help people realize that when they're triggered, when either the event is happening or a reminder of the event can kick that same trauma loop off, we get triggered and our prefrontal cortex goes offline and we are in our mammal brains. We've flipped our lid. Right? And sometimes it's easiest when you're in that state because, again, the language centers are in our prefrontal cortex. I may not be able to really tell you what's going on, but I can show you that I feel flipped. So that becomes a really handy little tool to just help people understand what's happening to them, that it's not something they're deciding to do. It's something that their brain is wired to do for them. And to help them be able to show that they're having a trigger time, even if they can't speak about it. The long-term impacts of trauma can be anything from depression, anxiety, those are extremely common, addiction, eating disorders, relationship issues, anger issues, self-harm, cutting, burning, trouble sleeping, having flashbacks, nightmares. It's just kind of a top of my head list of how trauma impacts us as an individual. I think in my next slide, I start talking about how it impacts us as parents.
I feel like I checked 7 off of that list.
Me too.
I think I just like checked it. Like, yep, that's me, that's me, that's me.
It has a lot of impact. So the thing about traumatic experiences, particularly in childhood, is we don't know what normal is when we're kids. Whatever we live in is what we think normal is. So I might not have any concept that I've been traumatized because that's all I know. And it's not until I get to my adulthood or as I'm starting to parent that it starts to occur to me that, oh my gosh, I would never do to my child what was done to me. What's up with that? And then I can start to look at, oh, maybe that wasn't normal. Maybe my instincts are normal. And then I can start to grapple with, okay, maybe that depression is coming from what happened to me instead of just my brain needing additional chemicals.
Yeah. I feel like I've gone through that exact mode of thought. Like when I had my first son, I was like, something doesn't feel right because I'm, want to parent differently from my mom, but then that feels weird saying that, especially to my mom. 'Cause, it's a battle between how I want to parent and how I grew up and what if there's a middle ground at all. And I think a lot of people's childhoods probably, I don't know, at least for me, it impacted a lot of how I parent and how I don't want to parent too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So actually, so the first point of there is our first model of how to be a parent comes from growing up with our own parents. And then whatever is normalized, whatever I just assume is good parenting or normal parenting, I'm going to redo it because that's what I know. So I'm going to replicate it. Then we also have those times where we can all remember, when I grow up, I'm never going to make my kids eat vegetables, right? Mm-hmm. Whatever that is. I won't be so mean. You're such a mean mom or dad. And we have those things that become inner vows. I will never, I will always, and those things can be helpful if they are saying, I'm not going to spank my kids. Right? That might be a helpful one, but there are other times where it becomes so rigid that it's not helpful. Like I won't let my kids go to somebody's house if I don't know what, all of the details, and then I might become too strict. The other thing I was thinking about too with how does that trauma impact parenting is when you have your little baby and they're so small and they're vulnerable and they're dependent, it pulls up those feelings for you as an adult. It helps you remember being younger because now you're faced with that daily, and those feelings of vulnerability and powerlessness and helplessness that might be tied to the trauma are going to come closer to the surface. So I think particularly around postpartum and things where your hormones are cruising and the depression's building from all the hormonal imbalances, there's also this trauma kick that can add to that and make it even more difficult. As your child ages, if there is a certain time where your trauma occurred, if you were molested by somebody in the family and it started at age 4, then when your child, is particularly same-sex child, gets to be that age, it may trigger a repressed memory. Like I may have shut that out of my mind, like that never happened. My family didn't seem to notice. It must have been okay. Nobody cared. But now my child's that age, and bam, now suddenly it's exploding in my brain like, oh my gosh, I don't want that to happen to my kid. That's not okay. Wait a minute. Why did that seem okay then? It was never okay. So that I think is one of the real, the times where the trauma can come forward the most is that triggering because you want something better for your own child.
Are there some adults or some parents who, before you can even remember things, if something happened when a parent, a person was 2, and say their child becomes 2, and you have no recollection really of, the trauma that you went through, but you know that something, I guess, does that become triggering then to like someone who doesn't really recognize their trauma from when they were 2, but does that repressed memory, I guess, play out at all? Or since they were so young, does it not really affect them at all?
It absolutely affects. So what we think about as memory is generally a image memory, because we all watch TV, we see flashbacks up there. But our verbal memories start around 3 or 4, which is generally where we have conscious memories as children. But what happens is those early memories of early trauma they're still lodged in the body, and we have body memories. So I might have unexplained pain. I may have emotion that's not connected to any particular image. I might not have words for what I'm feeling because it's a really early memory, but it absolutely still impacts everything about my life. And that gets kind of difficult to get to because you can't tell anybody that you're feeling bad necessarily, and you don't know why. And our brains like story. Our brains like to know why and what is that about, and I might not have the words for it. But there are a lot of somatic processing of looking at where that stress is held in your body and ways to help your body release that stress that will help ease those traumas and heal that as well. And then the last one I put down there was that phenomenon that once you have a kid, nobody cares about mom. It's always about, oh, look at how cute the babies are. And yeah, you're supposed to do everything. And it doesn't matter if you never have time to pee. It's all good. Are you taking care of the kids? And that feeling of suddenly becoming invisible, or, everything being about your children and not about you, can intensify feelings of abandonment or neglect or inadequacy. So if you've already got feelings of not being worthy of care, having all of that happen, and especially because our culture is so good at mom shaming, like there's nothing you can ever do that's good enough. Somebody will tell you should do it different. All of that's going to make it really difficult if you're already struggling with self-esteem issues or feeling worthy of being cared for. Those neglect feelings mean that your needs were never addressed, and suddenly at this stage in life, nobody's addressing your needs or even acknowledging them, because suddenly now the child becomes the focus for most everybody. So I think that's another place where the trauma can get enacted and start to play a role.
Goodness, it's like you are in my brain. Like you were peering in my window as I had my children, at least my second child mostly. Because I'm a second child and she's a girl and she's a second child. And I think I relate a lot to, I don't know, like I got extremely triggered just finding out that she's going to be a girl and knowing that she's the second child. And something from my past is, I still haven't even figured it out, but something from my past is triggering a lot of emotion with her. And having trouble bonding with her. But, we're bonded now, but in the beginning it was really hard. So that's really interesting. I never thought about that last point that you were talking about.
Yeah, and particularly when you're talking about the second child, because that's kind of the lost child position in the family, where all the older kid is the first, and the baby of the family gets all the baby, and the kid in the middle is just like, oh yeah, that's our bonus kid.
It's
great.
All right, and then I think one of the questions that you'd pre-given me was, does it only impact your parenting? And the answer is absolutely not. Trauma is pervasive, right? If I flip my lid, that means I'm not using my rational thinking brain anywhere, which means that I'm going to be more reactive, more emotional, and that's going to impact everything around me. All of my interpersonal relationships may become more difficult. Trusting other people becomes extremely difficult. So as a parent, that might lead me to become overprotective. No, you can't go to anybody's house to play. Ask your mom if they can come here. Or nope, no, you're not going to get a babysitter. Only certain people in my family are allowed to watch you. But it also can be the opposite if I've pushed all that trauma down and I've not recognized it at all. What I've done then may become that I've normalized abnormal behavior, and then I might not recognize danger signs because I think they're normal. And then what I'll see is parents that are allowing family members that abuse them to babysit their child. And then they're surprised when their child is abused also. Wait a minute. And if that person was unsafe with you and nothing's changed, then of course they're going to be unsafe with others. But if I've pushed all that away and I haven't allowed myself to think about the fact that that person was unsafe with me and it hurt me, then I'm not going to know enough to protect my own child. Okay. Intimate relationships, right? Somebody really getting to know me, being close to me, can produce a lot of anxiety, and that might make me create fights to push people away. I might find myself not really connecting and feeling bonded with my spouse because it feels safer not to have any attachments. So it impacts everything. I think being a parent is one of the times where we allow ourselves to start looking at the impact of the trauma because we want better for our kids. So we're willing to look a little bit at our own pain at that point in our life, where other times in our life it might feel easier to just ignore it and push it away. So that's it for my slide. So we'll go with questions and answers from here, and let me get the screen share off so we can see everybody.
That was awesome. So yeah, I feel like I learned more about trauma and, you know, what that really kind of looks like. Because yeah, I mean, like you were saying in the beginning, I've always thought about it as like huge events. And I was like, oh, I've never had any huge events that have happened, you know, like, so I don't have any trauma. And then thinking about it from the way that you were describing it, like, oh yeah, I have trauma. So if somebody, you know, feels like, yes, there's something that I want to change in my parenting and maybe it's related to my childhood, what kind of first steps do you think they should take?
Well, I'm a counselor, so I'm kind of biased towards get a counselor and kind of sift that out. Robin's Hope is there. One of the things we do at every meeting is the card deck is built off of the ACEs study, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. It's a study that really looked at what are the physical health implications of childhood traumatic events. So to study that, they made a checklist of 10 traumas that could happen in childhood. And it's not exhaustive, but it's a good baseline. And you get a point for each of those things. So you come out of the little test with a score from 0 to 10. And I'll go through them real quick just so you get an idea. You can score yourself. You get 1 point. Sounds bad, like you're trying to get points for horrible things. But there are 5 things that can happen to you and 5 things that can be happening around you on this particular scale. And those are physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse, which is being told you're stupid, worthless, or will never amount to anything. Physical neglect, which is not having adequate food or clothing, and which may be because of poverty, or maybe because parents are so bound up in their own issues that they're not taking time to take care of the kids' needs. And emotional neglect, which is just not knowing that anybody cares if you live or die. Feeling like nobody's plugged into your emotional needs as a kid, they don't even notice. So that's 5 things that can happen directly to you. And then the 5 things that can be going on in the household are that a parent might, or caregiver might be struggling with mental health issues or suicidal thoughts, that they may be struggling with addiction, that there's domestic violence happening in the home, that there's a family member that's incarcerated, or that there's family separation or divorce or death of a parent early in life. Okay. So you have a score now from 0 to 10 from that simple checklist. And what they looked at is they looked at things like heart disease, asthma, lung disease, suicidal thinking, hospitalizations, depression, intravenous drug use. They kind of take a really broad view of all of these conditions. And what they found was mind-blowing, because they found that if your score was 4 or higher, you were at least 300 times more likely to suffer from every single condition that they studied. So unlike like heart disease, or like, well, if everybody in your family dies of a heart attack, you're 30% more likely to have heart failure, right? This is at least 300 times more likely to have asthma if you have an ACE score of 4 or higher, more likely to have COPD, to have immunodeficiencies. It was all over the place with physical health as well as mental health and substance abuse scores. So it's really a new thought for the medical community to look at the implications long-term of trauma in childhood. They also found that if your score was 6 or higher, your lifespan decreased by 20 years. Nobody wants to die early. So that kind of promoted okay, what do we do about this? How do we help get this better? And that's where the resilience training comes in. So that's what we're focused on at Robin's Hope. One of the biggest resilience skills is feeling connected to one supportive other. So we do everything in groups to start building those connections, forming those supports, so that it will build into all of the things that we're doing for ourselves as individuals as well.
That makes sense.
So that kind of takes that what is trauma and kind of pieces it to things like neglect is one of those things you don't have words for, because it's something that didn't happen. And I don't know that it didn't happen if I think everything that happened is normal. So it helps kind of start to think about some of that.
Yeah. Leanne, what questions did you have? I know I asked a lot already.
I was just wondering, because it's hard to, how do people come up to you? How do people know that, oh, it was a traumatic experience, not knowing, like, you know what I mean? How what enables them to approach you or the Robin's Hope, not knowing what had happened to them, or whatever they're going through is because of the trauma they experienced in the past? When are they aware of it?
It doesn't have to be. If you're interested in Robin's Hope, it's not like we're screening anybody. The door's open. Right. You're free to come in, check it out.
Right.
A lot of folks will come in because they've started their own individual therapy somewhere, and they want the additional support. Yeah, it takes a little bit of bravery. I found people are still shied away by the word trauma in the title. We're a trauma recovery center. Nobody really wants to like own that they're traumatized. But you know, toxic stress is another way of framing that. We can all kind of connect our brains to being overwhelmed by stressful events. Growing up or having a family member that's struggling with addiction is traumatic. It may not be life-threatening for you, but it is traumatic. So that's one of the things that people may come in for. We have folks that have lost loved ones to suicide or to addiction. We have people that have been in violent marriages, that have had horrible childhoods. You know, we have people that come in just because they wanted to know more and, you know, try it out and see if they feel comfortable there or not, if it really feels like it fits for them or not. We have people that go, I feel like something traumatic happened, but I don't have any memories yet. Right. Okay, let's work on those resilience skills, because when those memories hit, it's going to be hard.
Yeah. We had some questions from some people in the group that weren't able to attend. So one of them was, as far as bullying goes, how does being bullied as a child possibly affect adulthood and parenthood that you've seen?
So bullying is a nice euphemism for abuse from child to child, right? Because the behaviors that we're talking about are abusive behaviors. So there's that's just overtly traumatic in some cases. And other cases, they refer to it as microaggressions, particularly with girls, like the mean girl thing, where it's like these little catty comments, sideways remarks. Any one thing in isolation is not traumatic, right? If one time somebody tells me, "Oh my God, where did you get those clothes? Goodwill?" That might not be traumatic for me. But if that happens every single time I come to class and I'm always thinking that I'm feeling ostracized and I don't fit in anywhere, then that does become traumatic. So some of it's that layering effect, and then the impact of that is the same as any other trauma.
Do you think that makes someone who's bullied for, say, what you were saying about wearing certain clothes or having, just an unfortunate haircut from their parents, like when your child becomes maybe the age that you started getting bullied, does that usually make a parent like super protective of their child, and be very, I guess, obsessive, or about what they're wearing, what their child is wearing, and how their hair is? Like, does that affect that at all? Because I can see that kind of, maybe
Yeah,
playing out.
absolutely can.
Yeah.
Yeah, I might decide that that will never happen to my child. So my child always gets the $150 hairdo and any piece of clothing they ever desire. And now I may have overcorrected because now I've become too lenient and they become entitled. They expect people to just hand them everything. Or it may impact me in a way that I become more sensitized to that, and I start to ask my kid more, how is it going in school? How do you, oh, you don't like so-and-so? Why not? What do they do that you don't like? Maybe I just open up that dialogue more, and that might be a very healthy parenting skill that comes out of a traumatic event.
Yeah. Okay, so one of the other questions that we had was, how does violence and molestation affect parenting, which you kind of touched on throughout the presentation. But yeah, I guess violence and molestation as a child and the effects on parenting specifically, like, yeah, I know we touched on it, but if you wanted to expand.
Sure. I mean, it takes different turns for individuals. Trauma is very individualistic. I'm not going to respond the same way to the events that happen to me as you will respond to the events that happen to you. Violence growing up might make me avoid conflict. So perhaps I'm too lenient with my kids. By the time I get into teenagehood, if I have a male child, I may be afraid to set any limits. Or on the other hand, I may find that that's my only known way of parenting. And I know that if I scream and holler and intimidate, it's effective. And so maybe I become too aggressive myself as a parent. With molestation, again, you usually get into being overprotective or being unaware of danger signs and not able to set protective boundaries would be the two avenues.
Would you agree, like a few times, right? Like when you watch a movie or read a book, and there are a lot of times where I guess, the main character overcomes their trauma or, their challenges as a kid by confronting the situation, going back to that certain event, what caused their trauma. How do you feel about, would you advise somebody to just go to your crazy aunt who told you were no good, or go to your mom and open up? What would the impact of that be? Is it advisable to tell somebody, why don't you go to your mom and tell her what a bitch she was with you growing up, now that you recognized it?
So it's actually, we just had that conversation in a group yesterday. It really depends on what the purpose of the confrontation is. If the purpose is for me to speak my own truth, then sure, go for it. If you're expecting something from that person, probably not a good idea. I think the comment one of our members made was, somebody pointed out to me, like, why are you coming to me if I'm the one that hurt you? Why are you coming to me to make it better? That's not going to happen, right? A person who is unsafe and is acting poorly, they're not going to just stop being unsafe and poorly behaved when you bring it to their attention. 9 times out of 10, if you confront an abuser, they'll deny it or they'll blame you for it. And if you're not in a very strong position, that's going to be devastating, right? If you're already feeling like, I must have done something as a kid to provoke this kind of behavior, if I go to that abusive person and say, you abused me, you used to knock me around for no reason, what I'm going to hear more than likely is, oh my God, if you hadn't been such a brat, I wouldn't have had to knock you around. Well, that's not helpful, and it's not true.
Right.
So confrontation, if you're looking for an apology from your abuser, it's more than likely not going to happen. That takes a lot of intentional work on the parts of both parties. It's not impossible, but it's unusual.
During your resilience exercises or the programs that you guys have, how will you know when they've come to, I guess, what's the word for it? Like realization, or how do you, like when they come to terms with it, how do you know that they're okay or better from the time that they come into you? And
so I guess the short answer is we don't, right? The groups are open. People come when they want to. They come as long as they want to. They leave when they're ready. That's all individualized, so I don't really have to know. That being said, we do surveys every 6 months just so we can gather data and show our effectiveness and do all the things that nonprofits have to do. And we do measure trauma symptoms, resilience skills, and perceived social support. Those are the things that we kind of measure. So we track to see if those are improving. Mostly it's what the participants say, like, wow, I can tell this is helping so much. I'm setting better boundaries. I'm feeling more confident. I'm healing. And they'll say it themselves. And then when they feel like they don't need the groups anymore, then they either step into a leadership role, pay it forward, or they don't come, go off and live life. That's cool too.
right.
Gosh, I had a question just in my head that I was about to ask, and I just forgot. I guess I'll ask the other question from somebody that we got. So she was wondering, from being a like surprise child, one that wasn't planned, and separated, from the siblings by like 8 years. So she's the youngest, and her siblings are all, older than her by 8 years. That feeling of being such a big separation, how do you think that can affect parenting?
Well, I mean, again, it's going to be really individual to the family system. Not having siblings close in age to have to figure out how to share and how to fight might have some impact in just interpersonal skills in general. And the other part would be, how does the family system view the gap in age, right? So sometimes a child that's greatly younger becomes doted on by the older siblings, like, oh, they're so cute, and I'm going to babysit, and I'm going to pretend you're my baby. It's all good. And then other times they might be resented, like, now mom's attention is all taken up with this little infant's needs, and there's no time left for me. And there might be animosity. So those kinds of things would change how that impacts. And then if there was overt trauma in the mix, that's going to have an impact too, in different ways.
Yeah. So I guess it depends on the relationship with the parent and the siblings, for that person, like what can end up happening. I remembered my question. So is there anything that people can do at home if they experience something where, they were like, whoa, that wasn't something that I wanted to do as a parent, or, something that I don't even recognize in myself, and they think it could be related to a trauma from their past? Is there anything, people can do at home to kind of work on that if they're not ready to come in
Mm.
and, face it head on right away?
Sure. I want to say first that I think one of the things that your question kicked off for me is if I come from an abusive background and I find myself screaming at my kids or going too far with my anger and I feel horrendously guilty, like I'm going to be just like my abusive parent, um, that crushing guilt can be a real barrier. And to be able to give yourself some grace to realize that we all make mistakes. Right? So there's that self-compassion that I'm not perfect. Nobody is. I can make mistakes as a parent. I can yell, scream, or do whatever they tell me I shouldn't do as a parent, and my kids won't be scarred for life. I can repair that wound by going back and saying, Mommy shouldn't have lost her mind. It's okay. I'm going to try not to do that again. It wasn't your fault, right? I can repair that in a way that makes that a healthy interaction for my child, even if it's something that I wish I hadn't have done. So I want to say that first. And then if you're dealing with emotions that you do think are coming up from a past trauma, journaling is probably the best first place to start. It's just allowing yourself to sit with those feelings and start to identify where they're coming from, what they're about, if there are any pieces of memory that might be connected to them. And stop if it gets overwhelming. If it gets overwhelming, find somebody to help walk you through it. Because that's, I think, one of the big things with trauma treatment is having somebody that holds space for you, that just is there to help you close it down so you don't get overwhelmed, and is there to encourage you when you want to drag your feet, but is there to be with you so that you don't get lost in the mix of emotions. And that can be a pretty important place for a counselor to step in.
Yeah. There was one more thing that I wanted to ask, and I totally forgot. Oh, no. Okay. Do you think people with significant trauma or smaller trauma, like, do you think that affects the possibility of moms in particular to experience postpartum depression or anxiety, clinically diagnosed, as far as that goes? Like, yeah, are these past traumas an indication that they will go through that, or is that something that is just totally by chance?
I don't know enough about the medical end of postpartum to be able to answer that confidently. I think it becomes another layer for sure. I think you've got all these hormonal imbalances that are there that are going to be time limited. I think that if things persist beyond, I don't know what's typical for postpartum, but I would think 6 to 9 months. If it goes longer than that, then you're probably looking at there might be another layer to this that may be trauma induced. I think absolutely I'm more likely to feel anxious or depressed if I've had difficult things happen to me as a child, because now I'm responsible for this teeny tiny human.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was just curious because, like, I know in my own work, I thought, it was just postpartum depression and anxiety, like it's just hormonal imbalances. But then as I've been, working through that, finding out that that a certain event that, like you were saying, might not have affected somebody in a certain way, was really hard for me to process. And it's coming out in my anxiety for my children, and, kind of just looking so far in the future of like, oh my gosh, when they're teenagers, I'm so worried that such and such is going to happen. And it just built up this anxiety that ended up, wanting me to just hold them in a bubble, which then caused depression. It became this really hard cycle to break out of, and just, live in the present and focus on the present. And like, this kid is just still a baby. It's totally fine right now. But yeah, that forward thinking got me to kind of think about what was happening in my past and how that is affecting my parenting and is affecting, a lot of the relationships that I've had. And I found that being aware that trauma exists was very eye-opening, I guess. Like, it kind of just gives you, some framework to at least work around so that you can, you know, find your way through the path that you want to go, as cheesy as that sounds. But yeah, that was something that I discovered from just one diagnosis of something. Then like a whole Pandora's box kind of opened up. But it was good. It was good for me to go through that. I think like it's a blessing in disguise that like that dark period of time led to so much self-realization. So I found that really interesting that someone who doesn't even know they had trauma all of a sudden has like way more than they thought. But yeah.
Yeah, that's not such a good surprise.
Yeah.
But it is better to know what you're dealing with than to just be wandering around blind.
Yeah, for sure. Mian, was there anything else that you wanted to ask?
I think we've covered all of it. Basically the same, in the same boat, in the same situation as a lot of other mothers. We're going through the same thing. I feel like when we started to think about the topics that we were going to do for this group, when you mentioned the trauma, I never even thought of it. I never even thought of it affecting my parenting, and I had to look back, you know, having to recognize what the certain events that stand out to me, that makes me like feel it had affected my parenting. And certain events do pop up in my head, like the back of my head. I'm like, oh yeah, that definitely would explain why I'm this and that. And then now I just feel like maybe I should talk to somebody about it. It's come to a point where I haven't even like, you know, haven't gotten over certain things. And right now I feel like having to face it, to get over it, should be a priority at this point also, because my kids are getting older and I have a daughter and I'm looking at her, I'm like, you're gonna have such a bad life if you're ever gonna turn out like me. And you know.
Bye. Yeah, it's scary to confront those trauma, you know, incidents that, you know, maybe you repressed all the way down so that it's, you know, so you don't feel it. And I know I've done that. And I think facing it head on is the scariest part of the whole thing, because you have children involved that you want to take care of, you want to be the best for them. And facing these, you know, could make you think that like, as I'm facing it, am I not a good parent? But, you know, it's just so far from the truth. I think discovering things about yourself makes you a much better parent. Being curious about it makes you, you know, just such a wonderful parent that it's.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer, for, you know, being with us and joining us. Yeah. I thought this was great. I mean, I feel like I, you know, just used you for therapy right now.
No problem.
Yeah, no, it was great. So thank you so much. Where can people find you if you have like social media or website?
www.robinshope.com has all the information about groups, links to jump on, phone numbers. My email is jennifer@robinshope.com. So if you have questions or want to follow up, you can hit me up there as well. Awesome. But the groups are open. There's no registration. You can pop on right now. Everything's on Zoom, so you can literally pop on, introduce yourself briefly, like, hi, I'm Joe, and I'm just hanging out, and ride the lines and listen to what's going on. So feel free to visit.
Especially for someone like me who is afraid to go to therapy, like that's like the one thing that I'm so terrified of, just being vulnerable and, you know, having to dig everything in my mind and just knowing what's wrong with me. It's like, it drives me nuts. But for you to open and start something that, you know, where people can, you know, just come out and just be, you know, comfortable with talking about the experiences they had without judgment or without having to go
and one of the things that I did it for was to have people who are further along in their journey give
Right.
hope to those people who are just starting.
That's amazing.
One of the things that we've heard is we'll do these, even Heather will say it, we'll do the resilience skills, and we'll talk about, well, how does asking for help me heal? How does that resilience? We'll have this long discussion about it, and she'll be like, and 2 weeks later, I find myself going, oh, I'm doing it. That's what that was all about. So it's nice that we can talk about things that are fun, that are light, that aren't that big scary. I have to dig into the deepest recesses of my brain, but it's still healing, and it's still giving me those tools and those skills, and connecting with other people who have had similar experiences that can tell me, like, yeah, that one will be rough, but you'll get through it.
Do you have a lot of moms in your group, or what's the demographic look like?
We have a lot of everything. So we have mostly women. We do have 1 or 2 guys that are brave enough to show up. Mostly women. Their ages range from 18 to 70. Probably the majority of the folks in the room are parents, with different age children from, I don't know that, yeah, we have some with little ones, and then we have some with teenagers, and a little bit everything in between, some with adult children now. So it's a pretty good mix. Different groups will tend to draw different audiences too. We'll have, some people that will always come to book group, and then some people that will always come to the support groups in the evening. Sometimes it depends on schedules. Some people can't come except at the 6 o'clock group for after they get off work. Other people will camp out all day and get as much as they can in.
Right.
That's awesome.
That's amazing. That's great.
Yeah. So check out the Zoom, and I think it's a great group to join. I want to check it out.
Yeah, I feel like I'm going to be there.
Yep.
Awesome.
We'll see
Look
you
forward
there. Well, thank you so much again, and we appreciate your time. And we'll be posting this on our website, which is motherhoodrva.wordpress.com, and
Awesome.
and also on our Facebook. So, yeah. Well,
great. I'll look for that and put a post on the website, hopefully, to send people there to check it out too.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye.